things about me, right? And I wouldn't disagree. Hey Rob, how are you? Good to see you. So we are so excited about today's program. We actually, how many of you are fairly new to the community? You've lived here 3 years or less? Raise your hand. Okay, 5 years or less? Okay. How many of you have been here 10 years or less? Raise your hand. Okay, so it's about a mixture. So we have some great stories to tell in our community, some things that have been generational stories over the last 20 years that have made a difference not just on Coweta, but on our state. And there's not a lot of communities out there that can claim that have that big of an impact on not just their local community, but their statewide community. So over the next year, we're going to tell some of our stories in Coweta, and we thought it would be fun. Mitch Seabaugh showed up in my office not long ago, and we started talking about just some of the things that we'd all been involved in over the years, and some of the things he has done personally when he was our state senator for, 11 years, I believe, and then, 8 of those is the Senate Majority Whip, which is the most influential position in the Senate, and he represented our community well. And it was during that time frame that he had an opportunity to do some really cool stuff to impact Coweta, but also impact Georgia, and in many ways our country. So we're very grateful. I would like for everybody just to give a warm round of applause to Mitch for his service. Now, before I bring up the panel, let me share just a few things with you to sort of lay the groundwork. So over the past several years, we've seen many movies and television shows filmed in our state, from throughout Georgia, as well as in Coweta. How many of you driven down, is it Greenville Street with the house, and they repainted it, and they've got all the equipment out there? That house has been in a lot of movies, right? So as a result of all of this, Georgia's been given the moniker Hollywood of the South, and recently everything from The Walking Dead to the Netflix original series Stranger Things to blockbuster hits from the Marvel franchise have been filmed right here in Georgia, bringing an economic impact of $7 billion in fiscal year 2016 alone. That's a lot of movie magic happening around our peach state. However, what many people don't know, and what you're going to learn about today, is that without the collaborative effort of 5 individuals, including former State Senator Mitch Seabaugh and former Riverwood Raleigh's Studios owner Paul Lombardi, in the early 2000s, that magic may never have happened. Today, we want to tell you the story of how your community played a large part in creating Georgia's booming movie industry. In fact, if not for Scott and Mitch and Paul and others, I don't know that there would be a booming movie industry in Georgia. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today and have them come up to the director's chairs that Scott has so graciously provided. And you'll notice that 2 of them, they're actually real chairs that got used, right? Mr. Tigelaar and Mr. Lombardi. So y'all have to fight over who gets to sit in the Lombardi chair. But let me introduce to you, we'll start with Mitch, if you don't mind, if you'll sit in the second chair to my left, your right. Please help me welcome former state senator and former Senate Majority Whip, Mitch Seabaugh. I guess you each have your signatures on that. So now help me welcome Mr. Scott Tigelaar, who is the president of Sonoy Enterprises, Inc. and Nick and Norman's, Inc., and the former president of Riverwood Raleigh Studios. Yes, the middle one that has your name on it. Is that your name? Oh, that's okay. And then another special guest that we have with us today, who's been a part of this from the beginning as well, is Mr. Greg Torre, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Marketing and Communications for the Georgia Department of Economic Development. it on. Oh, there you go. Green button, can you hear me? You have the other mic. Okay, so we are going to make this fun this morning and just give you an opportunity to answer some questions, and then we're going to let the crowd answer some questions as well, okay? So why don't we start with, let's begin with Greg, okay? So Greg, if you could tell us a little bit, you've got your mic on, right? A little bit about the history of the movie industry in Georgia and what happened before Mitch, Scott, and Paul created Magic and created the tax incentives that we currently enjoy.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having us here. This is a great opportunity to talk a little bit about an industry that I love. I'm with the Department of Economic Development. I was been there, just celebrating my 30th anniversary, which is amazing. I came in as a very small child. So basically, this office, in 1973, there was a movie called Deliverance that was shooting in North Georgia. And at the time, the then governor, Jimmy Carter, went up there and to check it out. And it turns out that these companies that were coming from California brought a lot of money with them and spent a lot of money. And so from there, the department, within the department, the Georgia Film Office was formed. And so that was sort of one of the first offices in the U.S. to actually start actively promoting a state to the movie industry. And at the time, in Los Angeles, runaway production was happening. They were leaving Los Angeles to go to places where they could get more value for their money, basically. Fast forward to the 80s, we're doing very well, continuing to grow. The era of Burt Reynolds and Smokey and the Bandit and Sally Fields and all those movies that you know and love, and many of them were shot around here, was in the 80s. And late 70s and 80s continued to grow. And I had actually started at the department in 1987. And so fast forward to the 90s, basically. And really up until then, when we first got the film industry, started here in the 70s and 80s, it was location driven. Companies came here because they felt like they could get a very unique and different location from Los Angeles, for example. Plus, they would save money. Then in the 90s, it turns out that not only could they get the right location, there was a growing crew base, so they could also get labor here. And so everything was going well. We did a lot of Miss Daisies and Glories, and Fried Green Tomatoes happened during that time, very successful. And then, kind of fast forward to the late 90s, early 2000s. And I became director in 1998 at the Film Office. And at the time, a lot had happened. And one time Runaway Production was a production that ran away from California to Georgia. Then it was actually going from Georgia to other places. And what was happening is, it wasn't just location and workforce anymore, it was actually about incentives. And what we saw is states like North Carolina, and we saw states like Utah, up the ante, offer up meaningful and valuable incentives to companies where they could affect their bottom line by getting these incentives. And also at the same time, Canada, we saw the rise in Canada. The exchange rate was part of it, but they also offered really juicy incentives that made a difference. And what we saw is all of our production suddenly went from Georgia to these other states, and ultimately to Canada, and that included the movies of the weeks, and all those sort of projects that was going on. I remember, kind of a turning point for me. I was scouting on a movie. Well, wait a minute. So '98, we made a little bit of progress in '98. We got a very small sales tax exemption passed. It helped a little while. But basically, we were scouting for a movie called Ray, the Ray Charles movie. I don't know if any of you saw that ultimately. We were scouting for that, and in the middle of that scout, it turns out that the director, producer got a call that Louisiana had just initiated a very significant significant tax rebate, and so they moved to Louisiana. And at that point, as I had just become director, I thought, what are we going to do with this industry? And at that point, it was, when I became director, it was like, maybe we switch to digital, maybe we switch to do something else, because we weren't going to have an industry here, as far as I was concerned. We made a lot of progress, we built a crew base, we had all these great assets, but it wasn't going to do us any good at that point. And so, at that time, I was busy researching what other states were doing, what we do to have a part of this industry. And at that point, I remember I had gotten a call from Senator Seabaugh. And at that time, we kept a pretty low profile at the film office. And I didn't talk to many legislators at that time. And so Mitch called me and said he was interested in the movie business, which I found amazing, but exciting. And we began a bit of a relationship. I did a little educating. I talked to you about the industry, and found a great ally within the legislature. We had some leadership in the department that believed in us. We had the community that believed in the industry. And now we had a champion within the legislature that believed in the industry. And so at that point, we began to make even greater progress. And I guess that's where I'll leave off this.
Yeah. So I was at this Divergent Leadership Workshop in Washington, D.C. last week, and one of the things we learned is as a community, you want to create opportunity for collision. And the more collision that you create, which is people with different viewpoints or walks of life or frames of reference, the better the opportunity you have to create magic. So I kind of look at you guys as the perfect example of the collision and then when the stars were aligned at the right moment in time. And Greg, I remember when Scott walked into my office almost 15 years ago, and you had just moved here from Canada and from the financial industry. And you had a pretty big opportunity, challenge, if you will, ahead of you. And Scott's going to tell you a little bit about his role and the role that the Central Educational Center has played in all of this, which how many of y'all know that CEC is an integral part of how the movie industry in Georgia began? Anybody? Okay, so if you'll tell your story, Scott.
Okay, thank you. I'll back up a little bit and dovetail into Greg's timeline. My uncle and his dad, my great uncle, had built the studio during kind of Georgia's heyday in the film industry here, original heyday in the 80s. They had grown up and worked in the film industry in Los Angeles since the 1940s. Paul's dad had, and Paul had grown up in the industry. And as more and more motion pictures and shows had started coming to Georgia in the 70s and 80s, they wanted to build a studio, and that was not possible financially in Los Angeles at the time. They looked to where the production was going, and it was going to Georgia. So they built a studio here in Coweta County, just outside of Sonoy, bought the land in 1986, and the place opened in 1989, and had a very strong run during that original heyday of the film industry, and a lot of productions were based here in Coweta County and had a good financial impact on the county. When that runaway production went from going to Georgia to going to Canada, the studio was often empty, and our industry was dying here, and we had to do something because we were in a position where incentives had gotten so good in other places that you couldn't give away the studio space to a production company and even come close to competing with what they were getting elsewhere. So that puts you in a pretty tough position from a business perspective. You'd have to pay somebody to come here, and that doesn't work. I used to be here in the early 90s. I was working at the studio when it was busy, and I came back in 2003 to help get an incentive passed in Georgia, because at that point, if you didn't have an incentive, you didn't have an industry. And quickly got connected here in the community and met our state senator, Mitch, at that point, and a lot of business leaders. And our position with the studio was we either need to get an incentive or we need to get out of the business entirely and stop messing around somewhere in between, because it doesn't work. And so we talked originally about an educational collaborative with the CEC, as you mentioned, to where we would help train up people in the industry and at the same time pass an incentive for the industry to bring the industry back and then help supplement the crew base. So that's kind of where it all started, and obviously run into a financial challenge. How do you pay for all that? And that's where the discussion began with Senator Seabaugh. And we said, well, we need an incentive, and if we build it right, it'll fund these types of initiatives to help educate people and put people back to work in this industry. And, you know, I had never worked in politics at all, and I thought, hey, we've got a senator who's interested in a tax incentive. This shouldn't be very hard. But it was challenging. We had to educate people. And one of our first conversations with Mitch was, you know, he said, look, I'm not going to get involved in this if it's not going to be economically good for the state of Georgia, attractive to the industry, because there's no point in building an incentive program that they're not going to use. It's got to create jobs for Georgians, and it's got to be done in such a way that it's financially responsible so that it can be sustainable. We don't want to do something that some other states had done. They had overgiven on an incentive program that was too rich, and they couldn't sustain it. And that had already happened out there in some other states. And so those were kind of the parameters that Mitch had set. And we headed down that road, got introduced to Greg, who was the director of the film office at that point, and quickly in a friend of ours from Disney, who was the head of tax at Disney. And she was known as the Queen of Tax. She doesn't like that title, but we call her that all the time because she doesn't like that title. She was the Queen of Tax in Hollywood. She was we joke with her, we said she was the nerd that did all the homework on tax incentives, and all the other studios followed her lead. Wherever she said there was a good incentive, the other studios followed because they knew she'd done her homework. And she was the expert. And I want to tell you, we introduced these two, Mitch and Marianne, and then got out of the way. I mean, it was like winding them up, and they just took off. They became friends. They're friends to this day. She was in town last week. We all had dinner just to reminisce a little bit and talk about what's happened in the past 10 years since the incentive that we have today was passed in 2008. And it's been a huge financial impact. And she's here often because of Marvel. Disney owns them, and they do a lot of work right in this area. They're in Fayette County at Pinewood, but that spills over into Coweta County, and we like to say high tide floats all boats, and in this industry it really does. We have The Walking Dead at Riverwood. They probably spend about $65 million a year on that show, and they've been doing it for 8 years so far. And knowing Inside AMC just bought the studio this past summer, yes. I haven't seen Paul since. So he's been around the world fishing, I think. But it's a demonstration, I think, of their intent to be here for the long term, to be a member of this community. Their commitment not only to the show, but to Georgia and to Coweta County beyond the show. AMC films about 3 shows in Georgia right now, and they have intentions to film more. So a lot of people say, well, what happens when Walking Dead's done? Well, I think we'll get a tourism effect from that for years to come, but I think AMC has intentions beyond that as well, which is great news. So that's our little background.
Yeah. So, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, and I don't know how many of y'all know this, there are now 16 full production movie studios in the state of Georgia, is that right? Since 2010, if you go back to the 80s, for years, Coweta, Raleigh, was the only full production movie studio in the entire state of Georgia. So it began right here in Coweta County. And I know Marilyn wanted to be here today, and I think she had a previous engagement or she would have been here. And maybe someday we can have her come share, some of her insights on the industry side. So Mitch, if we hadn't had you in office at that moment in time, I'm not sure where we would be with this. And we've been very blessed in Coweta to have some great elected officials over the years, and you by far have been one of the best. And we miss you, and we're happy that you found success elsewhere, but you have a legacy that will live on forever in our community and our state. So the piece of the puzzle that was missing in all of this was the legislation and the support of our elected officials. So Mitch, you have such a great story to tell. Tell us how you began with the collaboration. We've heard a little bit as they've set it up, but what you did to lead the project through the legislature to where it is today, and how you did that.
Well, in 2003, many of y'all don't remember because y'all weren't born, but we had just we were going through another one of those economic crises. And when I say we, my team and the whole thing, I don't want to get too political, but we had just been given the responsibility for governorship of the state. And so we were trying to learn how to even be able to govern. We had a budget where we were having to cut a bunch of money, and many of you don't know my background, I'm a reformed CPA, I got out of it. So finance is kind of my background, so I was kind of helping lead the charge and how we were going to balance our budget, what cuts we were going to make. And so all of a sudden I have these individuals walk into my office and they talk about this education component, the partnership with CEC. And I'm sitting there going, guys, there's no money. I mean, you know. And I remember to this day, Paul Lombardi goes, I have an idea for that. And that's when they laid out the tax incentive opportunity, what it would do to bring revenue to the state. And then maybe from that we could use that money to help support this educational aspect. So I listened to him, and then I called Greg. Greg won't tell you, he told me one time before when I called, he thought he was in trouble because nobody ever called from the General Assembly about anything unless they were, you know, something was wrong. And so I shared with Greg about the meeting that I had with Paul and Scott, and about what they were talking about, and wanted to do my homework. And Greg was so gracious, he helped set up a trip that we went out to LA. And part of that trip was I visited Paul's shop. They had just finished filming The Last Samurai. Great movie if y'all haven't seen it.
And tell them what Paul's company does.
He's a special effects director, so when you see things that are blown up or falling apart or moving, basically, that's what he does. And so I went to his shop, and we're sitting there, and this started with the education component. And he was sitting there and showing what they do as a special effects director. He said, somebody has an idea, and he said, we have to go and we have to develop prototypes. And he said, that to me is the best kind of education. That's why I want to be part of the CEC, because instead of teaching people just to take a blueprint and frame a house, they had to develop a prototype. And that's when I got it as far as what impact the industry could make on the education component. So to do that, we had to start working on the incentives. So Greg was very gracious in setting up meetings with the studio. And one of the meetings that we had was with the MPAA. Now, MPAA has this, of course, as years go by, to me, the table gets bigger. But that's,
so tell everybody what MPAA is.
MPAA is the Motion Picture Association of America. So it is all the major studios. When you had this big table sitting around, all these executives, a lot of salary money was in that meeting. And they're looking at me and having this discussion. But I mean, when you're looking at their name tags, it's Warner Brothers, it's Paramount, it's Disney, it's Sony, it's, who else? Warner Brothers, Fox. And they're sitting there, and so we went to the meeting, and I asked a simple question: what makes a good incentive? Because I expressed to them that I wanted to work to build a partnership with the industry that was good for the industry, but also good for the state. And Scott's right, there are a lot of states that are out there thinking they could get the industry to come in for a year or two, and then they could roll back on their incentives and the industry would stay. Well, these individuals taught me that the industry was not that way. They basically were very nomadic. They were going wherever they could get the best deal. And so we worked on what would give an incentive to develop a long-term partnership. And I cannot say enough about Marianne Hughes. And I asked Marianne if she could be here. She really wanted to be here, but she had a meeting today with the Brazilian president. And she couldn't be there, but she really wanted to be here. And she was bought into what we were talking about and the vision. And these individuals taught me what the industry really was. And most people don't know what the industry really is. They think of actors and they think of cameras. The industry really is, if you go walk through CEC, that's the industry. And that's what it took time for me to really understand of who would get the benefit of this. Not necessarily the actors or the studios, but people that would be put to work. So we had a real good meeting with the MPA. We talked about that, the important things they wanted, you know, a tax incentive that was simple, something they could rely upon. They talked about Louisiana had passed one, but how complex it was, and everyone rolled their eyes with regard to that. So we were working with Marianne to make sure we had a good, simple, and reliable tax incentive. We started working on legislation to develop that. Mary Ann was absolutely instrumental. Y'all have heard horror stories about when industry gets involved in writing legislation, and what they do, they create a bunch of loopholes that they can exploit. Mary Ann didn't. Mary Ann knew what it is that we wanted. She wanted as much as we did, something that benefited the state and her industry, and she helped make sure those loopholes were not in there, so that the legislation that we passed would last, and there would not be this bad image of the industry of coming in and taking advantage of the state. Well, then it came the thing of getting people involved in doing this. So Greg helped me set up what we call the major players, chairmen of committees, and those that would have to go through the industry. So we went out to Stroke of Genius. We took a handful of them out there so they got to be a part of it, to see what the industry was, be a part of it, and every one of them made it into the final production except for me. So God has a real sense of humor with regard to that, but
That was a nerve-wracking day.
Oh, I bet it was. Especially, when you think about a bunch of legislators, most of them are really, self-absorbed. We had to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, so we get to 11 o'clock and all they did is stand around.
Mitch, so tell them what the production was, what the movie y'all were.
The Stroke of Genius.
Yeah.
The Stroke of Genius. And the only reason that was being filmed here at that time is because the Jones family said it had to be filmed here in Atlanta. If it hadn't been for that, they wouldn't have filmed it here. They would have told the Bobby Jones story somewhere else. And the family insisted on that. So we got them involved in that. We had our first bill, and our first bill didn't make it through the General Assembly and get final passage. So we come back the next year, and all of us worked very hard on educating people what the industry was, what the value of it was. We developed an incentive, and it wasn't really what we wanted. It wasn't as high as we wanted. It wasn't as high as what we thought that the state could afford, as you could say. But Lynn Westmoreland taught me a real good principle. Sometimes you just got to take 3 yards in a cloud of dust and get the momentum going. And so we settled for an incentive that wasn't as good. We tried to put little tiers in it to get it filmed outside of the Atlanta metro area. And we got a couple productions with that, but we still needed to work on getting a much better incentive. And so even after we passed the first one, we went to work on the next one that we needed. And we had built a lot of momentum at this point in time. A lot of the industry was involved. And they have what they call Georgia Night out in LA. And I went out there for one of those, and it was amazing. This is supposed to be for people in LA to make Georgia attractive, come film in Georgia. It amazed me how many people I met that were from Georgia working in LA, and they said, I want to come back home, I want to come back home. So there was a lot of momentum that had been built up, and I'd been working with Governor Perdue, who really wasn't sold on it the first time. But I remember when they had the characters from Wild Hogs that came here to promote the movie, of John Travolta, William H. Macy, Tim Allen, William H. Macy that came in, and they went to visit the governor and talking about the incentive. And I remember after they walked out, Governor Perdue turned to me and said, I get it now, I get it. So we went to work on our second incentive, which we passed in 2008, and each one of those bills passed unanimously except for one vote. That was an expression one of my colleagues used one time. We tried to figure out what that meant. We only had one person that voted against it both times. So that's where we got the incentive that we basically have now.
Okay, so just to educate the audience a little bit, you were a state senator. Could you introduce that bill?
I could not introduce that bill.
And why is that?
So the piece of legislation that I worked all those years on doesn't even have my name on it, because the way the structure is, that's a finance bill, and finance bills have to originate in the House. So I had to get the House members to find someone that would carry that bill, to author the bill, get it in the process, and get it all the way through and get it passed. So it doesn't even have my name on it.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So you guys have talked a lot about the collaboration, and this is a quote, Mitch, from you, where you have said time and time again, there's no limit to what can be accomplished when no one cares who gets the credit. So talk a little bit about that, because it's not easy as a state senator to find somebody else to champion your cause.
Well, in politics, nobody's going to promote you. Nobody's going to promote you but yourself. You have to do this. Self-promotion is a big issue. But the thing that I'm most excited about this morning is that I get the opportunity to talk about those individuals who have not got the credit that they deserve. Paul and Scott and Greg and Marion Hughes were so instrumental in making. They're the ones that educated me. They're the ones that informed me. They're the ones that helped me to understand what the vision would be. Marion was a great partner in doing that. And through the entire process and all the work that we had to go through and do, not a single one of us made a particular point of that was my idea or this was my point or anything like that. And it was about what the common result was and where we were going to be. And I have just been so honored to have the opportunity to work with these people, to see what it's done in the state, what it's done in my community. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate having the opportunity to work with them. I consider myself to be honored to do that. They were patient with me, and I had to learn the industry. And we went through the process. And when you go through the legislative process, I remember crossover day. We had to get the bill through the House, and it's like 10:30. The bill hasn't passed yet. Scott's calling me and he said, "Are we gonna get it passed? We're gonna get it passed." So be patient, be patient. The speaker's told we're gonna get it through. Just And but truly, that was a Ronald Reagan quote that I borrowed. To be honest with you, Reagan's one of my heroes. And really, if you look at it, if we will put aside what it is that for our personal spotlight, and we work collaboratively with people, then there is no limit to what can actually be accomplished.
So, Greg and Scott, so you have been working on this many more years before you hooked up with Mitch. So, what were some of your biggest barriers over the years? Maybe that one thing out there that you thought, oh, we'll never overcome this.
Biggest barriers. The industry, a lot of it is hard. It's hard for people to understand how it works, and it really some of the best ways to do it is actually go to a movie set. I think that was one of the things that we did, with Mitch, and we've also done with other legislators. Anybody that we want to help to understand the industry is once you go there, you get a chance to see the amount of labor that's been hired and all the other pieces that come into it. The other aspect too, it's always been tough to relay the economic impact of it, because the reality is, just looking at it, looks like a big studio out there making money, but the reality is when a movie company comes into a community, they spend a ton of money at small businesses. They spend money at lumber yards and hotels and rental cars and dry cleaners and grocery stores and I think that's been a little bit of a challenge for us, is being able to help talk about what economic impact means and how it really is so widely spread out, and that's been a bit of a challenge for us, is to be able to talk about that among other things. And I think if you look at a manufacturing plant that may be down the street, it's very easy to kind of understand. You see it, there's an assembly line, there's a parking lot, there's all these other aspects to it, and it's very real to you. But with a movie company, they come in and it's like a movable factory, a moving conveyor belt. They move the parking lot every day, they move the commissary every day, they move everything every day, sometimes twice a day. So it's just been difficult for us to make sure that people can get their arms around the concept.
Well, when you see, in the case of Marvel, $200 million get spent in a 6-month period, and when you witness the magnitude of that, it's impressive, and it tells a story. And it's like Greg said, and like Mitch said, it's people in Georgia working in Georgia, and more now than ever before. What we had originally talked about with the CEC has now come to fruition with the Georgia Film Academy that the universities and technical colleges got together with the governor and created to educate people in this industry and create jobs for Georgians and bring back the people that were working in other places because there was no work here. And I do want to take a minute to just say something about Mitch here, because he's too modest. This would not have happened without this man's effort. In Coweta County, we had the best state senator ever. It's been my only experience in politics, and it's been great. So I'm the only one who can say that, probably. But
stop while you're ahead, right?
The MPAA that he met with, that was the heads of tax from all the major studios. So Marianne and her counterparts, after they finished their meeting with Mitch, they were saying, that's the first senator that's ever come from a state and asked us what we wanted. Wow. How amazing is that? Everybody else worked so hard and they passed some legislation and built an incentive, and then they went to Hollywood and said, look what we got for you. And half the time they said, well, we can't use that. I mean, it doesn't work for our industry. From the very first day Mitch got involved in it with them, it was, how do we make this work for you? And then on the Georgia side, how do we make it work for Georgia so that this can be here forever? Because if it wasn't built to be sustainable, you wouldn't have the 16 studios built in this state that get no incentive. All that capital infrastructure, all the equipment that's bought for the industry, all the buildings that are built to house the industry, all of that is outside of the scope of the incentive. And I don't know what they're at on the construction cost of Pinewood at this point, but it's got to be up close to $100 million, maybe $75 million, and they're still going. That's capital infrastructure. They're building $1 billion residential development across the street that wouldn't have happened without the studio being there. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's because the industry and its incentive was built to be sustainable by this man right here.
Absolutely. Let's give it a round of
Talk about barriers, if you give me a moment. Let me explain the incentive, because there's a lot of people that have misunderstood what it is. How the incentive works is that the industry has to come and spend dollars in Georgia first. Most people, they think an incentive means that the state or the local government is taking your tax dollars and put it out there and giving it to somebody, hoping that they will come. This incentive, they have to come to the state and spend the money first. And of the money they spend, they get a tax credit. Now, what the industry does, they create a corporation, they film the production, and then they sell that production to the distributor at cost. So they don't make any money in Georgia. So what good is a state income tax credit to them? Well, that's where we made it to where it was transferable, to where they could sell that tax credit to guess who? Georgians, who could pay their taxes at a discount. And so then they get the revenue and helps to offset the production costs. So a lot of people really don't understand how that incentive works that way, because if the industry doesn't come, and it has to be on a production, like you said, the infrastructure, they don't get a tax credit on that. They come, they film a production, and they get credit on the amount of money they spend in Georgia only. And then they sell that tax credit to Georgians who settle their tax liability at a discount.
So, Mitch, when you were our state senator, you were known as a very conservative senator. So people have wondered kind of how you married the two together, your conservatism with Hollywood typically being known as a more liberal group. So my question is, how were you able to look beyond the differences to focus on the outcome of a common cause?
I was at dinner one night in LA, and I'm not going to mention the person's name of who this happened with, but we were talking about the incentive. Most dinners are working dinners, even though, like even last week, we reminisced a little bit, but we spent 3.5 hours still talking about what we need to do in the industry going forward to keep it strong. But we at dinner one night, and I don't know how it came up, but it came up that I have an R behind my name, and I remember the person looking at me going, "You're a Republican?" And I said, "Yeah." And they looked at me and said, "And you're interested in the film industry?" And I looked back at them and I said, "I thought it was about jobs." "Isn't that what it's for you? It's about jobs?" "Well, yeah." And so it was important to understand what the cause was, what the end result was, and put aside certain minor little differences and focus on what the real big thing was at hand and the benefit that it could ultimately render. So that was the last discussion with regard to that. And I've always believed that difference of opinion is very important, because to me it's always about getting it right and not being right. And I just had a great opportunity of working with, I call it the Rat Pack, and I felt like everybody felt that way. We felt that way, that we knew what our cause was, we wanted to do, and if we had any minor differences about things, we quickly put them aside and focused on the end goal.
That's so funny you said that. I was thinking of y'all as the Rat Pack in my head. And for the younger ones in here, they may not know what that means, and then that was followed by the Brat Pack.
And Candace, Mitch brought his conservatism to the table with respect to building an incentive that didn't give more than the state got. In the most conservative analysis, he wanted this incentive to be at least revenue neutral for Georgia. So that if you looked at it in the most conservative scope, we were at least at a break even. I think the result, because at that point it was theoretical, hey, if we do this, this will come, this will come, this will come. But the result has been 10 times, if not more, what we'd originally envisioned. And it's been so much better for Georgia. They're having trouble just keeping up and keeping track of how good it is. And there's people who say, oh, all incentives are bad. And some incentives are, they're what they call corporate welfare. This one was crafted in a way to make sure that the state of Georgia got more than what it gave back. They had to come here, they had to spend the money first. They never would have come here without the incentive. One of the barriers that I think we had to overcome was the perception that, what does Tom Cruise need more money for? We've heard that a lot. Why are we giving something to these left-wing Hollywood rich people? That's not what it's about. When the revised incentive was passed in 2008, our economy was going off a cliff. And the first movie that came to our studio as a result of the incentive was a movie called Killers. It was with Ashton Kutcher and Katherine Heigl. I don't know if anybody saw it, but at the time it was the most filmed in Georgia. It was $75 million. And walking around the sets where they were building the sets, all the people working on that film had been working in the housing industry months prior and had lost their jobs. So it became, it was about people in Georgia paying their mortgages and surviving and growing in an industry that has just exploded. And that has helped more than anything else. It has nothing to do with Tom Cruise. He's getting paid by a film company to show up and do his job. And it's not even anything about the film company. They're going to go spend their money on their production somewhere. And they're going to pick the best place to do it. And they're picking Georgia right now. And we just want them spending their money here and hiring Georgians here and helping businesses here. And that's what's happening.
Absolutely. Go ahead, and then we're going to wrap it up with a final question.
It is from a Department of Economic Development perspective, it's about jobs and investment. Economic development is nonpartisan. But I just want to give you one quick comparison, basically. When I left the film office and moved from film office to global commerce in 2006, I thought, I'm leaving on a high note. We had $250 million in economic impact. In FY17, it's 9.5, actually. You had FY16, but it's 9.5 billion in economic impact. 320 projects shot last year. In the first 30 years of the film office, there were about 400 projects and right around 10 billion. So that just gives you an idea of the way things are going. Lee Thomas runs the film office right now, does a great job. But this has made a difference, and it works, and it's turned out to be a great boon. And again, from a department's perspective, we look at an integrated economic development approach. It's not just a manufacturing plant, or not just tourism, but it's also all these other pieces, which includes film.
And I think that's why we refer to that as a generational project, because of the scope and the impact that it's had. So you guys, let's end with talking about the future. You've mentioned the word sustainable. So when you look at the landscape of Georgia today, beyond, what was the billion, how many billion?
9.5.
9.5 billion, 16 full production movie studios, the camera-friendly designation that communities can earn. Now you can get a degree in the film industry offered through our Georgia university system. None of that existed before. However, there are those that have tried to tear it down, that are not fans of it. So there's always going to be a need to keep the message front and center and on people's radar screen. So how do you make it sustainable beyond what you've built, which is a solid foundation? And what do you anticipate on the horizon that might be a barrier? And what can we do? And what support would you need from a community like ours and others in order to ensure that it stays successful?
I will.
It's a continuing education process. Our legislature changes over regularly. Not everybody is there forever. And so constantly educating our legislators about the benefits of this industry so that when somebody who just wants to attack any and all incentives, and there's those people out there, and they attack this one, you know, in addition to everything else, getting those legislators out to see places like Pinewood in action, to see what the industry is doing, to now be able to sort of analyze the data of spending and where it's being spent. Production companies giving their budgets, you know, and their receipts to the state and saying, this is where we spent it, you know, and proving, you know, how it's happening and how it's good for Georgia. When we started this, we didn't have any of that. We didn't have any track record. We had, you know, anecdotal stories from the 70s and 80s, and nobody was capturing the data on the spending and then analyzing it within the lens of this incentive program. So doing that on an ongoing basis, and fortunately we've got such a strong industry and it's growing and growing and growing, if somebody takes a hard look at it, it's hard for them not to recognize the benefit to the state of Georgia. And that's happening right here in this community, and it happens at a community level. You know, Carl Smith Lumber in Turin, they sell a lot of stuff to film companies. And that's a whole layer of business that they didn't have 10 years ago. There's so many stories like that, and I think that as a community, as we have the opportunity to sit and talk with our legislators and give them feedback about what's working and what's not working in the community, this is one of the things that they hear the most positive responses on because it touches so many businesses. You know, at the studio level, we couldn't, like I said, we couldn't compete with incentives out there because we're such a small part of a production company's budget. Everybody looks at an independent studio like we were and say, oh, they're making all kinds of money. We're one of the smallest line items in the budget. But the hotel owners, the people who sell fuel, the building supply, the equipment, rental companies, all those people, they're the ones that have to give that feedback to their legislators to let them know that it's working. You know, in 2003 when I came down here, we used to try and get people to come to the state and show them around, and it was always easy to get a hotel room, or you know, in this area, whether it was Peachtree City or Newnan. I mean, there was plenty of capacity. I can't even book a hotel room in Peachtree City right now because of the production companies taking up so much of their capacity. Ant-Man, which was the first Marvel movie, spent or booked 24,000 room nights in hotels just during their production window. That's amazing, and that's what pumps, you know, money back into the local economy and helps that hotel do a makeover, and that helps, you know, the construction industry, and it just ripples and ripples and ripples. We're fortunate in this county to have one of the shining examples of the tourism benefits of the film industry, which was never calculated into the scope of the benefit of this incentive. And yet, little Sonoy, that nobody had ever heard of, and as she used to say, go check it out, it's not such a crappy little town anymore. Nobody had ever heard of it. There was 5 businesses left on Main Street, and now people from all over the world come to visit and spend their money there because they're fans of a TV show.
Right.
And the same thing happens where they film Vampire Diaries. That show's done. It's no longer in production. People, the hotels are booked solid over there for fans of Vampire Diaries. Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. You remember that movie? Back in the 90s. And the tour in Savannah is still booked for Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I mean, people still come to Sonoy for Fried Green Tomatoes, which was shot 27 years ago. That's something that will continue to grow and get the benefit of, and we've got to take advantage of it. And it's something that's not even part of what they calculate as the benefit of this incentive, but it's all over the state.
I would say that as far as to make it more sustainable is that the stories have got to get told. Because, again, people have a concept of what the industry is, and they need to understand truly what the industry is. And while none of this, believe it or not, none of this that's happening is a surprise to me, because what these guys taught me about what the industry was looking for, and I saw that we had it here in Georgia. What did surprise me the most is actually the impact that it has really made in people's lives. A couple years ago, we had the opportunity to tour the Walking Dead. My wife is a huge fan, and so we go, and we're visiting the set, and this, what was her job?
She's a publicist.
Publicist. She comes up to me, and she grabs my hand with both her hands. Now, having met a lot of people in my political days, when a woman grabs your hand with both hands, she's got something that really heartfelt she wants to communicate. And so I looked at her as far as, and she starts to tell my story, her story. She says, I want you to understand my story. 2 years ago, my family was facing bankruptcy. Our house was in foreclosure. My daughters didn't have the opportunity like other girls did as far as in ballet and dance and gymnastics. She said, but now I have a job that I absolutely love. I get paid well to do it. And then she went to tell me about how her family was not, worried about bankruptcy or mortgage payment. And then she took the opportunity to explain all the accomplishments her daughters had had in gymnastics and in dance. We were driving home that night, and my lovely wife, who lived all of this and has heard a lot of conversations, traveled with me many times, and heard me as far as deal with frustrations and talk about the industry and all that. My wife made this comment to me. She said, all these years I heard you talk about jobs. She said, but tonight I really realized how it impacts people's lives. And that is what's got to happen. People have got to let the decision makers know how it impacts their lives. Just yesterday I had somebody call me and tell me, they saw about the notice about today. I just want you to hear my story of the impact it's made on my business and how the significant impact that it's made in my business. I still hear from people like that. Those stories need to be told so that people understand exactly the impact that the incentive has made.
Well, I want to say thank you to the three of you. We have a little bit of time. Oh, no, we don't. So, if anybody has a burning question that you just can't stand and you have to ask, raise your hand real quick. Yes, Mr. McIntyre. Who's going to say no to the Godfather, right?
I don't have a question. I just got struck by several themes here this morning that I just want to point out. The exciting news here is not the movie industry, and even though I have huge ideas, but the thing that I see the themes are public-private partnerships working. You had a developer with money and vision, and you had a politician, elected official, that was willing to listen and made sense, do what it took to remove the hurdles for that industry. And that's what happened, and it's still happening in Sonoy today. The leadership that Scott and his uncle started over there, working with our local elected officials and downtown development group. Sonoy is a wonderful place. Still not as good as Noonan. It is wonderful. And I go there not because of Walking Dead, because I'm not a fan of that show. I don't watch it, but just the buildings and the shops that has happened. And the only reason it happened is a developer with money, with a vision, got our elected officials to help them spend their money so we can all have a better life. Mm-hmm. And then the next point is the elected officials. We need to elect elected officials that can get things done. Mm-hmm. Mitch Seaball came to see me one time and asked me to help him raise some money for his election. And I said, well, Mitch, you don't have any opposition. Why do you need money? And he said, well, I got to help the leadership in some of their elections. It costs a lot of money to be elected, to be in leadership. Well, it didn't make sense to me then, but he was in a position, he was liked in the legislature, he got things done. And I may be the only person in this room that thinks this way, But after he resigned, we didn't have that in the state legislature and the Senate for a long time. We do now. It was so important that Mitch was able to play well with it. And then jobs, I got my little baby boy back to Georgia because of his incentives. He lived in California in the movie industry, followed movies back to Atlanta when they were filming. He decided to get out of the industry. We had to support him for about a year and a half home. So thank y'all for doing it right. Thank you for being a leader. Scott, thank you for spending your money, and Mitch, good luck. Hope you run for elected office.
Let's give our panelists very much.